Welcome back to the Story of God Part 3 as we study the Apostolic Church, the beginning of the New Testament church. This week we're going to be looking at the witness of Paul. And let's just face it, we could spend 8 weeks or 12 weeks talking about Paul, but we're going to try to squeeze it into one session. And so I want to encourage you to download the notes that came in the same email as this video link, because they go into a little more detail, and by reading it, it will help you prepare for a time of discussion. So with that being said, let's dig into the story of Paul. Paul, fortunately, was a prolific writer. He was an educated person, and he wrote 13 letters that bear his name in the pages of the New Testament. That's really pretty impressive. And what's important for us to know is that every single one of these letters were highly functional in nature. Paul wasn't writing just to shoot the breeze. He wasn't writing to try to teach people primarily theology or doctrine through these letters. They are what we call occasional letters or circumstantial letters. He's writing mainly in response to his congregations. And so it's often a correspondence. The Corinthians have written to Paul, and Paul is writing back to them. And so in many ways, it feels like we're listening to a one-sided phone conversation. We only hear Paul's side. And so sometimes we can infer from some of his remarks, some of the sarcasm, maybe some of the things that the Corinthians or whoever he's writing to, some of the things that they are saying. Obviously, we don't have any of those letters. None of those have been preserved. But he's writing in response to problems. And so we find in these letters that Paul often says things like, I would really like to come to you, but I can't right now, and so I'm writing you this letter. Because in the ancient world, as I've shared in the past, the literacy rate was much lower. Most people could not read, and so the preferred form of communication was oral communication. Paul taught most of these churches what they knew while he was with them. And these letters are just written because of a special occasion, some kind of urgent situation has arisen in the church of Philippi or the church of Corinth. And so he's writing to try to help them resolve conflict. And in doing so, Paul occasionally shares some autobiographical information. He does it in passing, or he does it in an attempt to mount an argument. And so in Philippians, whenever he's trying to teach that community that no one can earn their salvation by good works, he talks about his own pedigree. He shares that he was a Hebrew of Hebrews, born of the tribe of Benjamin, circumcised on the 8th day, a Pharisee, and zealous for the law. So those are important things to know about Paul. We know that he was a really accomplished person. And his point was, hey, if I can't earn my salvation, then probably no one else can. And in his letter to the Galatians, he shares some of the events pertaining to the 15 years after his conversion. In Romans chapter 15, we find some of Paul's travel plans. And in 2 Corinthians, Paul reveals some of his struggles as an apostle. So that's what we find in terms of autobiographical information within the letters of Paul. In addition to Paul's letters, we find quite a bit of biographical information in the Acts of the Apostles, written by his protege, Luke. For instance, we find that Paul's birth name was Saul, that he was from Tarsus. He was a highly educated person. We've already noted that he wrote letters and was probably a decent public communicator. He studied at the feet of Gamaliel, the revered rabbi. Paul was Jewish by ethnicity, but he was also a Roman citizen, which proved to be helpful at times during his missionary travels. And we also find that Paul In addition to receiving financial support from his churches, he also supported himself financially as a tent maker. So as we look at Acts, we find, in addition to this autobiographical information, we find stories about Paul's conversion, his commission as an apostle to the Gentiles, and then 3 missionary journeys. And so the remainder of our time together is going to be primarily looking at the story of Paul as it unfolds in the book of Acts. As we've already seen, Paul was a religious zealot, to the point that he was willing to persecute others for their faith. We might think of him as being a terrorist, actually. He was authorized to imprison people who were a part of the Way. We've already talked about this in the very first session, that the Way was the name of the group of Jewish people who followed Jesus. And so while Paul is traveling on the road to Damascus, he has this revelatory experience where the resurrected Christ appears to him and says, "Paul, stop persecuting me." And what he means by that is stop persecuting the church, the body of Christ. And Paul experiences this 180-degree turnaround where he begins to follow Jesus. And he becomes what I think of as God's secret weapon. God could not have picked anyone off the face of the earth who would have a more radical turnaround in their life than Paul to be a witness of the resurrection. And unlike the other apostles, Paul calls himself an apostle born out of due season. And what he meant by that was he was the only one who did not know Jesus as a historical person. Paul wasn't a disciple of Jesus like Peter, James, and John. He encountered the resurrected Christ in a vision, and it changed his life, and he was used by God to essentially spread Christianity, the way of Jesus, throughout the Greco-Roman world. After Paul's conversion, he's commissioned to be an apostle to the Gentiles, along with his traveling companion Barnabas, whose real name is Joseph. He was given the name Barnabas, which means son of encouragement, because he had the gift of encouragement. He had this reputation for taking other men under his wing and helping them grow in their discipleship. And so we often think of Paul as being the primary ringleader of this missionary enterprise, when actually Barnabas is the one who's in charge on this first missionary journey. And in addition to Paul, Barnabas takes his cousin John Mark, which is pretty significant because most biblical scholars believe that there's at least a decent chance that this person, John Mark, is the author of the Gospel of Mark, which is almost certainly the earliest of the 4 Gospels. It was used as a source by Matthew and Luke. And so the fact that this person would be a part of Paul's missionary journey seems to be pretty important. We find out that on this first missionary journey, Mark leaves Paul and Barnabas. Not much is said about it in this context. But we find out later on this causes a problem between Paul and Barnabas, but we'll get to that later on. In order to really jump in and be able to track with what's happening in this missionary journey, we need to be somewhat familiar with the geography of the ancient world. And that can be kind of tedious. So instead of naming a lot of names and places, what I'm going to do is give you a brief summary of what happens. Paul and Barnabas travel to Greece and to Asia Minor. And their strategy is to go into synagogues first. Everywhere they go first to a synagogue. And they proclaim the good news of Jesus' death and resurrection to the Jewish community. And after they've exhausted what they believe they can accomplish, they go and spread the good news of Jesus to the Gentiles. And it seems like that there's always a mixed review. There are some people who respond positively, and in those situations, Paul helps nurture that community and they eventually become a church. Sometimes they get a really negative response. And so just to give you an example, in this first missionary journey, when Paul and Barnabas are in Lystra, they heal a man who is sick. And the people there, they go wild. They begin proclaiming that Paul and Barnabas are divine, that they are gods. But then, when Paul and Barnabas go to Iconium, they proclaim the good news of Jesus, and they're perceived as stirring up trouble. And so Paul is actually stoned to the point that he is unconscious. Stoning was the traditional form of Jewish execution, and so their intent was to kill him. And I believe that Paul actually may have died and was resuscitated, because in 2 Corinthians we have an account where Paul talks about what we think of as a near-death experience, where he actually goes to heaven and is present with Christ. But we get the sense that it was this visionary, mystical kind of experience, and then he returned to his body. And I think there's at least a decent chance that this is what happened to Paul while he was in Iconium. But anyways, my point is that as Paul and Barnabas travel, they receive a mixed response. But the good news is that sometimes people respond positively to the gospel message. Luke tells us that the first missionary journey ends with Paul and Barnabas returning to Antioch, and they stay there for a long time. After being in Antioch for a long time, and after this council that takes place in Jerusalem, we read about it in Acts chapter 15, Paul decides that he wants to go back and revisit all the places where he preached during his first missionary journey. He wants to go encourage the new believers and help nurture these new faith communities. And Barnabas seems to be on board. He's ready to go. The leaders of the church decide it might be good for Paul and Barnabas to take some other guys along with them to train them as missionaries. And so they take Silas under their wing, as well as another guy named Judas. Obviously not Judas Iscariot. The name Judas was an incredibly common name in first century Judaism. But Barnabas wanted to take one other person along with him. He wanted to take his cousin, John Mark. And as you remember, John Mark left Paul and Barnabas on the first missionary journey. And it doesn't seem to be that big of a deal. But apparently, Paul thinks that he's too fickle. He doesn't want John Mark to abandon them again. So he refuses to take John Mark with him. And it's at this point that Paul and Barnabas part ways. They have this conflict that apparently they can't reconcile. And so Barnabas, being the son of encouragement, he chooses to take John Mark. He sees the potential in him. He knows that Paul will be okay on his own. He wants to take John Mark under his wing and encourage him and help him develop as a leader. And so, presumably, Paul takes Judas, and we know that he takes Silas with him as well. They begin traveling. And they go back to this place called Lystra, where Paul has healed the man, and the people believe that he was a god. And while he's there, he meets Timothy. If you've read through the New Testament, you've probably heard of Timothy. Paul writes 2 letters to him, 1st and 2nd Timothy. And Timothy appears to be maybe a bishop, an early bishop in the church. So Paul helps him develop and grow as a leader. He takes him under his wing, and Timothy becomes one of Paul's travel companions. They travel into the area of Macedonia, and they go to Philippi, which is where we get the letter Philippians. So in Philippi, Paul and Silas are proclaiming the good news of Jesus, and as a result of creating this disturbance, they are thrown into prison. And they're worshiping God, and Luke tells us that it was around midnight, one night as they're worshiping God in prison, that there's an earthquake, and all the prisoners are set free. Now, the Philippian jailer, he knows that there are going to be major consequences for all of these prisoners set free, and so he's getting ready to take his own life. It seems like that it's probably better for him to take his own life than to have to be accountable to people who might possibly torture him. And so Paul and Silas say, "Stop, don't harm yourself." And the jailer looks at them kind of confused, like, "Hey, you know what's going on here. You know that I need to do this." And he says, "What must I do to be saved?" Now, the jailer is using it in a term, he's using it in a very physical way. How can he be physically preserved? And Paul and Silas respond, "Believe on the Lord Jesus Christ and you will be saved." Now, it's important to know that there's something political happening in this conversation because anyone who was a Roman citizen had to call Caesar Lord. And what Paul is saying is implicitly, stop calling Caesar Lord. This is what it looks like to work for Caesar. If you screw up, you're going to have to take your life. But if you make Jesus Lord, he will give you life. And so the Philippian jailer gives his life to Christ, and he and his entire household are baptized, and it becomes this household conversion. Paul and his companions, they continue to minister in Macedonia, but then Paul leaves Silas and Timothy behind in a community called Berea, and he travels to Athens, Greece. And it's while he's in Athens that he goes to Mars Hill, where all of the most sophisticated philosophers of his day were basically there in this think tank. They were just there to discuss philosophical ideas. And so Paul, while he's at Mars Hill, he sees this altar, and there's an inscription on the altar that says, "To an unknown God." And Paul uses this as an opportunity to say, "What is unknown to you, I will make known." And he begins to tell the story of Jesus. He's really contextual in his approach, and he quotes an Athenian poet by saying, "It is in God that we live and move and have our very being." Then Paul goes to Corinth. This is where he writes 2 letters to the Corinthians. And the synagogue ruler there, Crispus, and his entire family convert. And so Paul has some success. This is also where Paul meets Priscilla and Aquila, which was another Jewish couple. And Paul helps them grow in their faith. And as we will see, they end up becoming incredibly important figures in the apostolic community. And so Paul, in his second missionary journey, concludes with Priscilla and Aquila moving away from Corinth because they run into some trouble there, and they spend a significant amount of time in Ephesus. And as you guessed, this is the place that received the letter to the Ephesians. So this concludes Paul's second missionary journey. Luke tells us that Paul was stationed in Ephesus for 3 years. It's a pretty long time. And while he was there, he met a man named Apollos. Apollos was from Alexandria, Egypt. He was an eloquent speaker. He was probably a highly educated person. And it seems possible that Apollos ended up becoming the pastor of the church in Corinth. So along with Priscilla and Aquila and Silas and Timothy, we find that one of the patterns of Paul's ministry is not just proclaiming the good news of Jesus and starting churches, but also helping raise up the leadership who will carry on the ministry in those congregations. And for the last stint of Paul's ministry, it seems like he really uses Ephesus as his hub. He's stationed there, but he travels to other nearby communities, nearby cities, and preaches the good news of Jesus. And as we probably should expect, Paul ends up getting in trouble. He goes to trial, and while he's on trial, he could be set free, but he makes an appeal that he wants to go to Rome. And as a Roman citizen, he had that right. And so we can kind of infer that that was Paul's mission, was to get to Rome to spread the message of Jesus. He could have been set free, but he appeals to speak before the emperor. And so he goes to Rome, and that's kind of where the story of Paul ends. Based upon church tradition and church history, it's believed that Paul was executed in Rome. We know that he was under house arrest for 2 years while he was there. So Paul had an enormous impact on the Christian faith. He took the message of Jesus beyond the borders of Israel to the Greco-Roman world. He was a church planter. He raised up leaders to take over these churches. And one biblical scholar has estimated that Paul, during his ministry, traveled approximately 15,000 miles, which might not sound like a lot to us, but in the ancient world, that's quite a bit. And it's been estimated that 8,700 of those miles are on land. So Paul was quite a traveler. He was an eclectic individual, a Jewish man who could speak multiple languages. It seemed like he could fit in a lot of places. And he becomes God's secret weapon to spread the message of Jesus throughout the rest of the world. And so Paul is an important witness in the early church. We hope that you will join us again next week as we talk about the witness of the women who are both named and unnamed in the Apostolic Church. Until next time, take care and God bless.